The date is October 14th, 2009. We are at the Glenview Public Library interviewing John Crawford. His birth date is August 9th, 1924. The name of the people here are Edson, Matt, and Phil. He served in World War II in the branch of our U.S. Navy. He was at the rank of captain and served in Jacksonville, Florida, and Norfolk, Virginia. He repaired ships during his service. Mr. Crawford, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted. There were no enlistments permitted at the time I went in.
Do you recall your first days of service?
Yes, I do.
Could you elaborate on that?
My first day of service, I took a train from the Selective Service Office in downtown Chicago to Great Lakes. I was selected for training in electronics. I started out as, of course, an enlisted person. I ended up 37 years later as a captain after getting my commission following law school after the war. But on my first day, I went up to Great Lakes, and since I was selected for electronics training, they waited until they had about, I think, 100 people to form a company, and until they had 100 people, you got no uniforms. And I recall there were several people on December 14th, 1944, who would come in from California in sport shirts, sport coats, and we didn't get our uniforms. No company was formed until 6 days later. So it was a cold time for these friends of mine. I, of course, had, being from Chicago, winter clothing, but that's the main thing I remember about the first day, meeting these fellows who were not going to get uniforms for a couple of days.
Did you experience boot camp at all?
Did I? Yes, we had boot camp. It was an abbreviated boot camp because we were destined for school for electronics training, so we didn't take the full schedule of weapons training, things like that.
What was your job or assignment after boot camp when you were assigned?
I was assigned to take electronics training to become an electronics technician. So my first assignment after the company was formed and they had space at Wright Junior College, which is now Wright Community College on the northwest side of Chicago. We took a bus down there and we took 4 weeks of what they call pre-radio. And they gave us a crash course in electricity, basic math, trigonometry, geometry, algebra. And at the end of the 4 weeks, we were shipped down to Gulfport, Mississippi for the primary training, and that took 3 months. And we took more advanced electronics training and math, things like that. At the end of that 3 months, we were sent up to to a Navy pier. Navy pier at that time was a Navy school headed by C.C. Clubb, who became the first head of the Chicago branch of the University of Illinois. And then the school at Navy Pier was closed down when they built the Circle campus of the University of Illinois. But I spent 6 months at Navy Pier. At the end of the 6 months, I was made a third-class petty officer, electronics technician, third class, and I was sent to what they called a replacement depot. At that time, this was the end of 1945, the Japanese and Germans had surrendered, and they were bringing the ships home, and there was still a need for us, discharged people from active duty based on their number of points they had, which was based on the numbers served. And they did need electronics technicians. And I spent about a month at the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn, New York, where the Navy had its Rebel Devil, as they call it, a replacement devil. And at the end of the month, I was assigned to the USS Melville, AD-2, which means it is a destroyer tender. And the Melville was built in 1914 as a cruiser, and it was converted, which is the next step below a battleship. It was a big ship. It was converted to what you might consider a repair ship, a destroyer tender. And I spent about 6 or 7 months on the Melville, and we were in Jacksonville, Florida. The Melville had been working on taking care of the destroyers and destroyer tenders and other small ships which were assigned to convoy duty. And I'll have to tell you about that. But anyway, that's basically what I did. At the end of my time in July of 1946, I was discharged, and a young man sitting at a desk asked me on the way out, "Would you like to be in the Naval Reserve?" I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, you're in it. You just got discharged." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "Well, you can drill if you want to. You get paid for drilling every week or every month. And then you can advance in rating just like you were doing on active duty." And I said, "Will it cost me anything?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, I'll sign up." So I signed up in the Naval Reserve because it sounded like it might be interesting, and I stayed in the Naval Reserve for 35 years after that. I didn't attend any drills here. I lived in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, but I didn't bother to become affiliated with any Naval Reserve unit. But when I went down to law school at Georgetown in Washington, my roommate turned out to be a Marine pilot. He was a veteran Marine pilot. And he was going out to Anacostia Naval Air Station, which is right on the Potomac River there, directly across from the National Airport, which is now Reagan International, I guess. And he said, "You can earn a little money." So I said, "Sounds interesting." And he said, "I'll be able to fly you back and forth to Chicago." He was from around here, and he had to take training hops, so he said, "You can come with me." So I said, "That sounds good." So I went down to Anacostia, joined the reserve, and I earned, I think, $30 a month for going out there 1 weekend a month. And after about 6 months, the commanding officer of this maintenance squadron I belonged to, they call it Fleet Air Support Squadron, is what they called it, but it was basically another maintenance unit, somewhat like the, serving about the same purpose as the destroyer tender was on, but taking care of airplanes, of course. And after about 6 months, my commanding officer, who was working as a civilian at the Pentagon, he had been a lieutenant commander in the Navy at the time, helping build airfields. He was an engineering officer. He said, "John, I understand that you have a college degree. You're in law school." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, why don't you apply for a commission?" I said, "Well, how do I do that?" He said, "Well," gave me the name of a woman out at Navy personnel at the Naval Annex, which is in Washington, and I went out and I put the square pegs in the square holes and the round pegs in the round holes, and they made me an ensign. And so I stayed with the same squadron, and they assigned me as the assistant maintenance officer. And of course, the chiefs and the enlisted men who had ratings aviation ratings, knew more about things than I did. I served, actually, what I did for them was I served as an assistant administrative officer. There's a lot of work, there was a lot of paperwork at that time. Right now, the payrolls and attendance and everything is taken care of digitally, of course, but at that time, everything was done by pen and paper, like everything else in business. So I acted as the assistant administrative officer. And when I finished law school in 1951, I came back to Chicago, and I transferred from the unit at Anacostia to Glenview Naval Air Station. And I served in a phase round there for about 3 years. And then with my law degree and experience, I transferred from limited engineering officer, limited duty, to line officer in intelligence, and I served in the reserve intelligence then from that time until the time I retired in 1981. And I was promoted in turn, and I ended up as the officer in charge of reserve intelligence units in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri, basically just St. Louis, Missouri. And after I finished that 2-year tour as the Reserve Intelligence Area Commanding Officer, I retired at the age of 59 in 1981. So that is what I did, and I can tell you what I learned. I learned a lot after finishing my electronics training, because I found out that the convoys which brought the troops, the material across the ocean from the U.S. to England really helped keep England in the war. They would have been out of the war pretty quickly if we had not joined with them in 1941 and started furnishing them materials, food, material, troops, airplanes, ships. And quite a few of the ships I found out which were transferred to Britain or leased to Great Britain, part of the Lend-Lease in 1939, were old destroyers, and turned out that a lot of them turned up as escorts for the convoys. I mentioned that I spent about a month at the Armed Guard Center in Brooklyn, and the Armed Guard Center was the center for Navy gun crews who were put on merchant ships as the armed guard on these convoys. And I met a fellow whom I had gone to grammar school with. I learned a lot about the armed guard and the convoys, and it's a pretty dangerous occupation. There were a lot of ships that didn't make it across in the convoys. And when the merchant ships went down, well, most of the crews were saved. You know, we did that, but a lot of Navy men who were armed guards were lost, like the merchant seamen on the merchant ships. But I found out a lot about the joys of making the Murmansk run from New York to Archangel, which is up above the Arctic Circle in Russia, on cold nights, going through weather like that, and worrying about whether or not the U-boats of the wolf pack would be after you. So I learned a lot about convoys and how they helped save Britain, because Britain, you know, is an island. Great Britain is an island, and they imported all of their oil, and they imported a lot of material and food. And at the time we joined them. They had been at war for 2 years, from 1939 to 1941. And they were pretty short of food and everything else. And of course, there had been shipping between the States and Great Britain, even before 1941, of course. But we had to be neutral, and there wasn't much we could do. But once Germany made the mistake of declaring war against us, at the time we had declared war on Japan, we were then able to go in and give them more help. And the convoys were pretty crucial, not only in providing material to Britain, but also there were a lot of troop ships that went across. They were guarded by the convoys. And you've probably heard about the Dorchester. It was a troop ship, and that was sunk not very soon before. Well, they were almost over there, and they were sunk. And that was the ship on which the troop chaplains gave up their life preservers to other members of the other troops around the ship. So I did learn, at the Armed Guard Center quite a bit about that, about the value of convoys and helping win the war. And so even though I did not participate in any convoy duty, I heard a lot more about it when I was transferred to the Melville, because they, being an old ship, I don't think they ever made a convoy, but they were at the beginning or the end of the trip to take care of the ships that had been shot up. And I heard a lot about Plymouth, England. They had been there for a few years apparently. And I heard more about Recife, Brazil. Recife, Brazil is the closest point to the Azores and the Canary Islands and Africa. And originally the convoys, of course, were making the trip from New York or Halifax, Nova Scotia, or St. John's, Newfoundland, over to Liverpool, England, or other ports like that. But it's a much shorter trip from Recife, Brazil to North Africa. And so they did a lot of work off Recife, Brazil, taking care of the convoys, which later in the war were following that route. And the ship I was on was a very interesting ship. Most of the crew were skilled artisans. They were metalsmiths. And they told me that they could, if somebody would give them the steel, they would build a destroyer from the keel up. And I believe they could. Some of them were on that ship 4 or 5 years, because they were people who had been skilled workers before the war, and when they were drafted or enlisted, they were assigned to the Melville, and they were more valuable on the Melville, helping repair ships that needed their help, than if they were on a ship that was in offensive operations, as distinguished from maintenance operations, you might say. So I found out a lot from them too about the convoy duty. They, as I say, never participated in the convoy, but they took care of the ships which were in the convoys after they needed their help, and they helped equip them before they left on the convoy too. And all I actually did in Jacksonville, the war was over, they were bringing back the LSTs, the Liberty ships, the landing craft, and they shipped a lot of them to a place called Green Cove Springs in Florida, which was about 20 miles south of Jacksonville. And when the Melville got orders to go from Recife to Jacksonville, Florida, to take care of the small craft, at Green Cove Springs. When they came in at Mayport, which is the entrance to the St. Johns River, which flows west to Jacksonville and south to Green Cove Springs, the pilot asked them how far they were going. And they said, Green Cove Springs. And he said, well, you better have wheels, because you can't go any farther south than Johnsville with the draft you have. So they tied up in Jacksonville, and every day we would have a Jeep, and the electronics people would anyway. A lot of the work was brought up from Green Cove Springs to the ship to be worked on with the machinery we had on the ship. But we electronics technicians got on the Jeep every morning, and we'd go down to Green Cove Springs, and we would help mothball ships which later were sent to Bolivia or some other country. And I don't think Bolivia got because they're landlocked and they have no navy. But anyway, that is a story of what I did in the Navy. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Prior to your time in the service, did you have any training yourself in electronics or in shipbuilding or anything like that?
I was in the seminary at Mundelein, and I decided I wasn't sure I wanted to be a priest, so I dropped out, and that was June of 1944. And as I mentioned before, at that time I wanted to enlist, and I guess I was going to enlist in the Army, but at that time, instead of the services enlisting people and stockpiling them until they used them, the selective service system was instructed to, well, they stopped enlistments in all the services, and the different services, Marine Corps, Navy, Army, would tell selective service how many people they need on what date, and then the selective service system would just draft the number of people needed by each service. And I can't remember how I heard about it, but somebody told me that the Navy wanted people who had high school math and any advanced math that they had to go into electronics training. And that, of course, was needed at that time because, well, radar had been used very limited, to a very, very limited degree before World War before World War II. It was really needed for the Navy and for the Air Force too. And so the Navy had an arrangement that anyone who could pass what they call the Eddy test, which was a test, it was called the Eddy program, I think. He was a man from Northwest Indiana, and he set up a program for the Navy for training people as electronics technicians. And so I was told, if you go down to a Navy recruiting station and ask about the Eddy test, they'll give you one, and if you pass it, then when you're drafted, the Navy will pull you out and send you up to Great Lakes and put you in electronics technician training. So it sounded interesting to me. It sounded like I might learn something that I could use. So I took the Eddy test and passed it. So on the day I was drafted, on the day I went down to selective service downtown, they had my name in some file and was pulled out, and as I mentioned before, sent up to Great Lakes, made part of this ETM company.
During your service, how many hours per day did you work, and was that different than boot camp from what you experienced there?
Well, I think while I was going through training during that year, we had classes for probably 4 or 5 hours a day, and then we had exams all the time, and we probably spent 2 or 3 hours at night, studying. And we had some military training too, marching and all that. But I would say it was probably something like 8 to 10 hours a day. And I believe we went 6 days a week. I know on Sundays I was free, yeah. So that's what I did during the training. And then in Brooklyn, at the Armed Guard Center, I can't remember what they found me to do, but I did something to keep busy. And until they pulled my name and sent me off to Jacksonville for AD2. On the AD2, we worked probably, this was, in effect, the war was over, and there wasn't too much pressure on us, but we spent probably 8-9 hours a day traveling to Green Cove Springs and working. And we also were required, even though I was a third-class petty officer, and the other electronic technician too, they pulled KP duty, and I also Holy Stone decks. This ship was built in 1914, and we had a wooden deck. And a Holy Stone is like a brick, and you take it, dip it in water, and then you scrub the peat deck till it's clean. And I did painting, and I also pulled my duty on the garbage scow. We were tied up in downtown Jacksonville, so all of our garbage had to be loaded in the scow, and it was taken to some place a few miles away, which was the local garbage dump. So I did that, and as I say, most of the time I and one or two others would get in the Jeep and run down to Green Cove Springs. But we did other grunt work too. So it was, but since the war was over, as I say, there wasn't too much pressure on us to work 12, 14 hours a day, as you would do if you had sea duty.
Do you have any specific memorable experiences of Glenview pre, during, or post service?
Yes. I had never been to Glenview. I think I may have heard about some air shows out there, but it was 1951 before I was transferred up there. But we did make a few flights back to Chicago, my roommate and I. They were navigation hops, basically. You would go to Kokomo, Indiana, or someplace like that, and he would keep a log. I would just be sitting in the back seat, as a passenger. And I remember flying into Glenview at that time, and then in September of '51, after I passed the bar exam in Washington, I came up here, I took the bar exam, and transferred into a unit at Glenview. And at that time, it was almost looked like wartime. It was 6 years after the war ended, but you had, there must have been 6 or 8 different types of aircraft there. And later, of course, we became what we called an ASW base, anti-submarine warfare. And the planes, of course, on the convoys, in addition to the escorts you had the airplanes which would form some protection in the air for maybe 300-400 miles out from the coast, and they couldn't go any farther. Then, unfortunately, the convoys would get into that dead zone where there was no air cover. But the science of anti-submarine warfare really advanced, and during all the time, beginning a couple of years after I was in the reserve at Glenview, it was really concentrating on anti-submarine warfare. And that's what they did until it was closed in 1995. Yeah. So that's my memory of Glenview. I always enjoyed it. I enjoyed the people I was with. We were veterans, and towards the end, of course, there weren't many veterans left. People retired. Most people retired at 20, 25 years. But I stayed in, I lived in Glenview, and so I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the people I was with, and so I stayed in the reserve until 1981.
You had mentioned that you never participated in convoys. What was your feeling towards that, either discouraged that you weren't able to or relieved that you weren't ever put in that situation?
Either one. I mean, I went in the service because everybody went in the service at the time, and I wasn't feeling bad about going in. In fact, I was glad about going in because there was nobody else around. A few people who were 4F, and I really feel sorry for them. I really feel that I learned a lot in the Navy, and I'm glad I did spend time in the Navy. But with regard to not being on convoy duty, no, I never even thought about that. I was there to mothball ships down in Green Cove Springs, and so I did that.
Did you have any friends or relatives that you enlisted with, and if so, did some of those friends go overseas, or were they with you in the Navy?
No, I don't remember any neighbors who went with me. Most of the fellows who were my age went in a year or two before I did, and they went in the Marines. One of my best friends went in the Marines, and he ended up on an amphibious tractor in Tarawa. No, pardon me. Well, I don't know what the reason was so on, but on Iwo Jima, he was in the thick of things, and one of the stories I remember he told me was about his cousin, whom I also knew, who was a lieutenant, Marine Corps lieutenant, college graduate and all that. And he saw his cousin as he was coming out of the shower. He was going in to take a shower, and about an hour later, his cousin got it from a sharpshooter right between the eyes. He was killed. 23-year-old guy who was from the neighborhood too. But I did meet a neighbor, fellow I had gone to school with at the Armed Guard Center, and he was enjoyable being with him. I think every age group, including my class, we lost three. I'm talking about people I graduated from grammar school with. I think 3 or 4 of my classmates were killed on duty. One was in the Air Force, in the, I don't know what, 9th Air Force, I think, which bombed the oil fields at Plesty, and he never came back from a mission. And I remember his parents were really distraught because they wanted to find his body. They never found his body. And the father turned gray overnight, I think, about that terrible feeling. Well, as I say, you know, I know a lot. I remember there were a lot of fellows I knew who were killed. There was another guy killed on the streets of Rome. He was a year older than I. Another fellow, he was the brother of a gal I was dating after the war, and she told me about her brother, and he was killed at Anzio Beach, and I stopped at the American Cemetery at Anzio when my wife and I were over there in Italy, and one of those American cemeteries, it's the most moving thing to see an American cemetery over there with row on row of white crosses, stars of David, and they born 1926, died 1944, you know. I know a lot of those fellas, yeah.
It seems like you've met a lot of people through your service. Have you continued any of those relationships post-service, and are there some in Glenview?
Oh, sure, through the Naval Reserve. I've been active in the Navy League now. I joined as soon as I think I joined a year or two before I retired, and I've been the president of the Navy League, and they, of course, it's a civilian organization, but I still keep in touch with a lot of the people who were in the Naval Reserve with me. As for the people who were ETMs with me, it was called Electronic Technicians, mate, at that time, by the way. Now they were just ETs, Electronics Technicians. I haven't kept track of any of them. I've heard of them. I think we communicated, wrote letters a few times, but the only one I've really heard much about was a fellow who took my place taking a gal to her senior prom. She was from Bronxville, and she was a cousin of a friend of mine here in Chicago. He told me to say hello to his cousin when I got there, and I called her. And so anyway, she asked me to take her to the senior prom, and I said, fine. 2 days before the senior prom, I was shipped out. So one of the guys who had gone through school with me in Chicago and who was also at the Armed Guard Center, the replacement depot, I talked to him. He was a nice guy. He said, yeah, I'll take her. And he married her. So I heard about them too later on. But most of them, several became lawyers, engineers, and they had reunions of the Melville. I went to one, but most of the fellows on the ship, I was 20, I guess, when I got on the ship, and most of the fellows were in their mid-30s, 40 years old, most of these guys. They were experienced people. And I went to that one reunion, and I didn't see anybody I knew, and, so I never went back to another one. But I've enjoyed being in the Navy League, and any other questions?
How has your service in the military either changed your opinion or reinforced your opinion, and has that attitude changed many years after your service?
My opinion about what?
The military or the war.
Oh. Well, I really think it's an educational experience. I think it's a good thing to, you can learn a lot joining the military, I think, and I enjoyed my service. I really was not exposed to any danger, like people going in the Army are nowadays. But I just think that if you're called, you should go. Now, they aren't drafting people anymore, but it's hard for me to have any opinion about, whether people have been in the military or not. Actually, I know a lot. My younger brother, for instance, he 12 years younger than I. He was not drafted, but he went in the Air Force for 4 years and never got the GI Bill or anything. He was just in that bracket where you didn't get any GI Bill. If he had stayed in a couple of years longer, he would have, of course. But I know a lot of people my age who didn't go in because they were 4F, and if they had been 4F, they probably would have gone in. So my opinion of the military, anyway, is that it is a good experience.
Going back to the GI Bill, has that impacted you at all after your service in the armed forces?
Of course it did. I wouldn't have been able to go to law school. My father was a furniture salesman for Sears, and he had 6 children, and going to college, I was on my own. But fortunately, we had the GI Bill, and fortunately for me too, the GI Bill, my credits under the GI Bill expired the day I finished law school. So I finished a year or 2 of college, 3 years of law school on the GI Bill. So that really has impacted me. I wouldn't have been an attorney. I probably would have been a teacher. I was thinking of becoming a teacher, and somebody told me, why don't you go on to law school, take a graduate degree? And I thought about it, and I figured I would, take advantage of it, so I did. So it really has impacted me, yes.
Is there anything that you would like to add that we have not covered already in this interview?
No, I don't think so. I made a few notes here. Let me take a look at it. Well, getting back to the convoys, Winston Churchill, in his History of the War, he said that the only thing he was ever frightened about during the war was about the U-boat peril. And they came close to going under. If America had not entered the war to help them, I hate to think what would have happened to Great Britain. So, no, anyway, I've said everything I want to. Do you have any more questions?
I don't think so. Thank you very, very much for your time, Mr. Crawford.
Where'd you grow up in Chicago?
Pardon me?
What neighborhood did you grow up in Chicago?
West Side,
Okay.
Laramie and Congress, 5061 Congress.
Okay. My wife works down near Garfield Park, so it's not that far.
Oh, well, I was in Garfield Park a week ago.
Ah.
I went to, my wife has dementia, and I have to get her out every day, and I'm leaving for Arizona 2 weeks from now, by the way, because the last couple of weeks have been terrible. I'm not on camera, am I? Hold on,